There is a moment, buried inside the loudest day Britain had seen in decades, that almost no one noticed. The streets of London on May 6, 2023, were so thick with people that the sound of the crowd became something physical, not just noise but pressure, a living wall of cheering that pushed against the windows and rolled through the stone. Flags everywhere. Red, white, and blue pressed against every railing, every lamppost, every face. The coronation of King Charles III had been building for months, and now it was here, and the whole city had turned itself out to bear witness. Millions lined the route. Television cameras beamed the procession to 1 billion people around the world. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every position had been trained for. Nothing had been left to chance. And yet the moment that would stay with people longest, the one that would later be described by the person who lived it as producing literal goosebumps, happened in the space of a few seconds, between a young soldier on horseback and a little girl in a gold carriage. To understand what that moment meant, you have to go back 3 years. Back to the beginning of a story about a woman who decided, quietly and with extraordinary determination, that the door marked impossible was just a door. Captain Elizabeth Godwin had grown up in Devon, in the green and quiet corner of England's southwest, where her family had deep roots in military service. Her grandfather had worn the uniform before her, stationed across Egypt and Gibraltar and India in an era when Britain still projected itself far across the world. She grew up with the idea of service not as an abstract concept, but as something real and inherited, something that ran in the blood of the people she loved most. She was a sharp student, an athlete, a person with fire in her. She played field hockey. She rode horses. She joined the school's combined cadet force and discovered that she was very good at the structured, demanding world the military offered. When she sat her A-levels at Trent College, she had already secured an Army scholarship and a place at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the most prestigious military training institution in Britain, the place where officers are made. Sandhurst is not easy. It is designed not to be. It is a year-long test of physical endurance, mental toughness, leadership ability, and character, conducted under conditions that are deliberately exhausting. Recruits are broken down and rebuilt. The idea is to find out, under pressure, what a person is made of. Lizzie Godwin found out that she was made of something exceptional. In 2019, when she graduated from Sandhurst and received the Sword of Honor, an award given by the Commandant to the very best cadet in the entire intake. Not the best woman, the best cadet. Full stop. The sword is one of the oldest traditions in British military training, and she held it at the age of 22, having beaten every single person who graduated alongside her. She had also been studying nursing at King's College London and working at the famous Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children while training with the Army Reserves. The combination was almost absurdly ambitious, but this was who Lizzie Godwin was, someone who did not believe in choosing between things she cared about. In 2020, she commissioned into the Lifeguards. The Lifeguards are the most senior regiment in the British Army. They date back to the 17th century, unto the restoration of King Charles II, who formed them as his personal mounted bodyguard. For 3.5 centuries, they had performed one of the most visible and recognizable military roles in the world: the ceremonial protection of the monarch, the riding in state processions, the sentry duty at Horse Guards Arch in Whitehall, where tourists gathered every single day to watch the soldiers sit rigid and impassive on their black horses. So the regiment was steeped in tradition in a way that was not merely cultural, but structural. It had been an all-male institution for its entire history. Women had been permitted to apply only since 2018, following a change in government policy driven partly by David Cameron's advocacy. The door had been open for 2 years, when Lizzie walked through it in 2020 and became the first woman ever to commission as an officer in the Lifeguards. She was 23 years old. The regiment moved her first to Bulford Camp on Salisbury Plain, where she commanded vehicles patrolling across Dartmoor and led her platoon on exercises in Gibraltar. She was doing what junior officers do, learning the job from the inside out, earning the respect of her soldiers, proving that her Sword of Honor was not a trophy, but a down payment on work she intended to keep delivering. Then, in 2022, she transferred to Hyde Park Barracks in London, the regiment's ceremonial home, with its red brick Victorian buildings and the stables that housed the black horses that the regiment had ridden for centuries. She arrived in London to a regiment in controlled crisis because Queen Elizabeth II was dying. What followed in the autumn of 2022 was something that no amount of training could fully prepare a person for. The Queen's death on September 8, 2022, triggered Operation London Bridge, a plan that had been rehearsed and outlined for years, but that now became devastatingly real. The Lifeguards were at the center of it. They would ride in the processions. They would escort the coffin. They would be part of the most watched state funeral in living memory, attended by heads of state from across the world, broadcast to billions. And they had almost no time. Lizzie later described the scramble as working in an absolute frenzy. The horses alone were an enormous logistical challenge. She remembered the detail with the clarity of someone who had been neck-deep in it. The regiment needed to shoe 200 horses in a couple of days. 200. The scale of it was staggering. She said later that it showed her what the regiment could achieve in a small space of time. That it was, despite everything, truly phenomenal. She rode in the procession at Queen Elizabeth's state funeral on September 19, 2022. The streets were even more packed than on Coronation Day would be. The silence was different. Not the roaring of a crowd celebrating, but something heavier. A collective held breath, the sound of a nation grieving. Lizzie described it afterward as a pretty somber, sad, unique moment. She was 25 years old, riding a black horse through streets full of the kind of silence that presses on the chest, and she did it with the composure her regiment demanded and the feeling she carried privately, because the regiment didn't permit anything else. The country buried its queen. The season turned, and the Lifeguards began preparing for something very different, a coronation. The preparation took months. Unlike a funeral, where grief provides its own terrible focus, a coronation is a performance of joy and majesty and institutional confidence. Every element has to project power, stability, continuity. The cavalry escort had to be perfect. Lizzie's commanding officer would later say that she led her troop in meticulous preparation for the coronation and commanded a division of the Lifeguards on the day itself. Meticulous. That word means something different when the audience is 1 billion people, and the principal being escorted is the new King of England. On May 6, 2023, London woke up to a city that had been turned, overnight, into something from another century. The Gold State Coach, the same carriage that had carried British monarchs for over 250 years, a Baroque marvel of gilded sculpture that weighed 4 tons and required 8 horses to pull, was being prepared. The household cavalry was in formation. The regiments were in position. The crowds had been gathering since before dawn, staking out their spots on the route, spreading blankets on pavements that would be cold and damp for hours before the procession began. Lizzie Godwin was on her horse. She was part of the sovereign's escort, the formation that rode alongside and around the carriage carrying the king. It is the most senior position the Lifeguards can occupy on a ceremonial day, and she was in it, a 26-year-old woman from Devon who had walked through a door that had been shut for 3.5 centuries. The procession moved through streets so loud that the sound was like weather. The gold coach carried King Charles and Queen Camilla. Behind it came other carriages, family, senior royals, the machinery of the monarchy in motion. And in one of those carriages rode Kate, the Princess of Wales. And with Kate rode Charlotte. Princess Charlotte was 8 years old. She was sitting in the carriage in her pale dress, wearing the small floral coronet that had been made for the occasion, and watching the enormous crowd that screamed and waved and pressed against the barriers. She had been to large royal events before. She had stood at the Queen's funeral, aged 7, with a composure that had made people stop and look at the screen twice. She had been to Trooping the Colour, where the fighter jets had made her cover her ears. She had waved from the Buckingham Palace balcony. But a coronation is different from all of those things. A coronation is older, stranger, more layered with ceremony. The gold coach had gone ahead. Now their carriage was moving through the archway into the palace forecourt, and the noise was enormous, and everything was happening at once. That was when Charlotte looked over and saw the lifeguard on horseback. She saw a woman. In a regiment that had been entirely male for 350 years, in the formation riding alongside the carriages on the most formal ceremonial day in a decade, there was a woman in uniform on a black horse, just one, riding with perfect posture, eyes forward, expression unreadable, everything about her bearing communicating absolute professionalism and absolute focus. Charlotte looked at her. Lizzie looked back. Charlotte was smiling. She raised her hand and waved. Lizzie Godwin said later that she got goosebumps. Not from the crowd, not from the gold coach, not from the historical magnitude of escorting a new king through the streets of his capital, from a little girl noticing her, from a child seeing something worth seeing and deciding, without ceremony or self-consciousness, to wave at it. In the middle of the most choreographed public event in the country, with every eye in the world trained on the procession, an 8-year-old princess spotted the one woman in the escort and waved like she meant it. Lizzie described it to Tatler magazine in an interview later that year as a magical moment. She said it simply, without inflation or drama, the way people describe things that genuinely moved them and that they do not want to oversell. A magical moment. She had goosebumps. She was 26 years old. She was the first woman in the history of her regiment. She had spent months preparing for this day, had ridden in a state funeral 8 months before, or had won the Sword of Honor at Sandhurst, had managed 200 horses being shod in 48 hours. She had done all of it right, all of it precisely, all of it with the focus and control that the lifeguards demanded. And the thing that gave her goosebumps was a wave from a child. There is something in that exchange that goes beyond the surface of it. Charlotte was 8. She could not have understood, in any intellectual sense, what it meant that the woman on the horse was the first of her kind. She did not know the history of the regiment or the policy change that had allowed Lizzie to walk through the door or the Sword of Honor or the 200 horses. She just saw a woman and responded to what she saw with the directness that children have before they learn to perform their reactions for audiences. But she saw it. That is the thing. In a carriage full of ceremony and noise and occasion, and surrounded by adults managing their expressions and their posture and their performance of royalty, an 8-year-old looked out and noticed, and waved. Lizzie Godwin carried that wave with her. She carried it through the rest of the coronation day, through the months that followed, through 2023, when she led 47 soldiers and 33 horses in an escort for the Princess Royal at the World Equestrian Festival in Aachen, Germany, by performing the Household Cavalry's musical ride, a series of cavalry drills set to music in front of 40,000 people. She carried it into 2024 and 2025, when she was training the next generation of soldiers at an army training regiment in Purbright, Surrey, teaching young recruits what she had learned, passing on the standard the Sword of Honor had asked her to set. She talked about it when she was interviewed. She talked about what it meant to be the first woman in the regiment, and she was clear-eyed about the responsibility that came with it. She knew that young girls were watching. She took that seriously. She said, in the way that people say things they have thought about carefully and believe completely. No matter what, you have to have a confident front, because if you don't believe in yourself, nobody else will. She meant it for her soldiers. She meant it for herself. She meant it, maybe, not for anyone who had ever stood in front of a door marked impossible and pushed it anyway. On the evening of September 5th, 2025, Captain Elizabeth Lizzie Godwin was driving home from her base in Pirbright when her car collided with another vehicle on the A322 Lightwater Bypass in Surrey. She was 28 years old. The other driver, a 30-year-old man from Bracknell, was arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving and being unfit to drive through alcohol. When the Household Cavalry announced her death on September 8th, 2025. They called her a trailblazing young officer. They said she was an utterly dedicated officer who worked tirelessly and always for the good of her soldiers. They said she was a truly kind, selfless, and committed friend to all, seeking opportunities even in the most difficult of circumstances. Her commanding officer said that history might record her as the first female officer in the Army's most senior regiment, but that she would want to be recalled simply as a tough and talented young officer doing her utmost to serve king and country and to lead and inspire soldiers. The tributes came from everywhere, from the Guards Polo Club, where she had ridden competitively, from the hockey teams she had played for, from the soldiers she had trained, from people who had watched her ride through the streets of London on a black horse and felt the specific pride of watching someone do something extraordinarily well. And from a palace, there is a specific kind of grief that belongs to public life. The grief that has to be worn correctly, that has to appear at the right time and in the right place, that cannot simply break open in the kitchen at midnight or stay in bed with the curtains drawn. It has rules. It has a shape. And from a very young age, Princess Charlotte had been asked to practice it. She was 7 years old at Queen Elizabeth's funeral. 7. Stop and sit with that number for a moment. 7 years old, standing in Westminster Hall and walking in a procession behind the coffin of the woman she called Gone, dressed in a small black coat with a horseshoe brooch pinned to it, a brooch that had belonged to the Queen Mother and been passed down through the family and gifted, by Queen Elizabeth herself, to this child who shared her great-grandmother's love of horses. 7 years old, in the full weight of a state funeral, with the cameras of the world pointed directly at her face, her posture, her hands, watching for the moment she might flinch or cry or slip out of the composure that the institution demanded. She did not flinch. She did something that people who study such things found remarkable. At the moment the coffin passed, a video caught her leaning slightly toward her older brother George, then 9, and telling him something. A lip reader later confirmed what it appeared she had said. "You need to bow." George looked at her. He looked at the coffin. He bowed. She curtsied. Perfect. Both of them, at ages 9 and 7, performed what their great-grandmother's funeral required, with a precision that most adults in that procession would have been relieved to match. The horseshoe brooch was small and diamond-studded and shaped like a horseshoe, which was the whole point. Queen Elizabeth II had loved horses with a passion that was not ceremonial or decorative. It was bone-deep, lifelong, and serious. She had her first riding lesson at the age of 3. She bred racehorses. She attended the races with something close to joy, which was a visible thing in a woman who was disciplined about what she allowed the public to see. The horseshoe was hers, in every sense. And she had given it to Charlotte, not to the eldest grandchild, not to the senior heir, to the small girl who shared her feeling for horses, who had, according to her parents, been introduced to riding as soon as she was walking confidently and had responded to her first time on a horse by shrieking with delight. When Charlotte pinned that brooch to her black coat on September 19th, 2022, she was not following an instruction. She was making a choice. 7 years old, and she was already thinking about how to carry the people she loved into the rooms where they could not go anymore. That capacity to hold something tender and keep it close while the world watches would define the public version of Princess Charlotte across the years that followed. The people watching from the outside saw the composure, the side-eye at photographers who got too close, so the way she managed her younger brother Louis at public events with the confident efficiency of someone who had been doing crowd control her whole life. They saw the wave at Trooping the Color and the careful curtsy and the expression that the internet described as Diana-like, not because it was performed to resemble her grandmother, but because it carried the same quality of interior life, visible just beneath a composed surface. What people saw less clearly was the education happening underneath all of it. Charlotte had been born into a family that was, by the time of her birth in May 2015, in the middle of a deliberate reinvention. Her parents, William and Kate, had committed themselves to a version of the monarchy that was less sealed off, less armored, more honest about the human beings inside it. William carried his own history, the particular damage of losing his mother when he was 15, and in the most public and violent way imaginable, followed by a childhood that had been managed and performed when what it needed was simply to be a childhood. He had spoken about the way grief had been handled, or not handled, and what the cost of that had been. He and Kate had decided together that their children would know how to feel things, and name them, and talk about them, without that being incompatible with the dignity the institution required. And so Charlotte was growing up in something unusual for a royal child, a family that talked. That played. That let the children be children at home, and understood the performance only happened in public, and even in public, the performance had limits. There were photographs of the 3 children at Balmoral that summer, in the last summer before the Queen died, and Charlotte in those photographs is entirely a child. Muddy boots, mischievous expression, none of the weight of what was coming. The weight came in September. It came with the flags lowered and the long queues of people filing past the coffin and the sound of the nation processing something it had known was coming, but had not been ready for. Charlotte wore the brooch. She told her brother to bow. She stood through all of it. And then she went home. And then she kept growing up. The coronation in May 2023 was different in texture from everything that had come before. The funeral had been silence and gravity, and the specific gray of a London autumn day turned into a national ceremony of mourning. The coronation was color and noise and the specific electricity of a crowd that had come to celebrate rather than to grieve. Charlotte was 8 by then, and she was in a carriage with her brothers and her mother, and the whole thing was enormous and gold and extraordinarily loud. And she was watching it all with the wide alertness of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she did not yet have all the words for what it was. That was when she saw Lizzie Godwin. The lifeguard on horseback, riding as part of the sovereign's escort, was the only woman in her formation. The gold coach had already passed. The carriage carrying Kate and the children was moving through the palace forecourt archway, and Charlotte looked across and saw her, and then waved. And Lizzie got goosebumps. What neither of them knew in that moment was what the wave would eventually grow into. Charlotte was 8. Lizzie was 26. They did not meet. They did not speak. The procession moved, and the day continued, and there was a balcony appearance, and a concert, and all the formal machinery of a coronation rolled through its program. But something had passed between them, the specific acknowledgement of one person by another in a crowd of millions, with no protocol required and no one to instruct it. The months after the coronation were full. The Wales family had moved from Kensington Palace to Adelaide Cottage at Windsor, which gave the children more space and a different rhythm to their lives. George, Charlotte, and Louis were attending school. Kate and William were managing the balance between royal duties and the particular demands of being parents to 3 children, who were, as Kate described them, in a rare moment of candid warmth, feral. The word made people laugh. It was also true in the best possible sense. These were children who climbed trees and got into scuffles and had opinions about seat assignments in carriages and told each other off with complete confidence. Charlotte's public moments through 2023 and 2024 became a kind of ongoing education in watching someone learn in real time how to be a public person without becoming only a public person. At Wimbledon in 2023, when she appeared alongside her mother watching the tennis, and the photographs showed her giving the photographers a look of such magnificent disinterest that it circulated widely, and people immediately recognized it as the same look Diana used to deploy in situations she found tiresome. Charlotte had never been told to look that way. She had not been coached in it. It was simply what her face did when she was 8 years old, and somewhat over the whole thing. At the 2024 Trooping the Color, that the horseshoe brooch was back. Charlotte wore it again, the brooch that had been at the Queen's funeral, the one given by the woman she called Gone Gone, the one whose horseshoe shape connected them both to something they shared. She was 9 by then, coordinating with her mother in matching aquamarine, and the brooch was small against the fabric of her dress, but the people who knew what it meant knew exactly what she was doing. She was carrying her great-grandmother into the parade, and she did it without announcement or ceremony. She just wore it. By the summer of 2025, Charlotte was 10. She had been to more significant public events than most adults attend in a lifetime. She had stood at a state funeral. She had ridden in a coronation procession. She had walked in Christmas Day crowds, been photographed at polo matches and garden parties and charity events, watched from the Buckingham Palace balcony as fighter jets thundered overhead and covered her ears without apology. And she had, through all of it, been protected. Her parents were careful and deliberate about the boundaries. No social media presence, no organized press access to school events, careful management of how much of childhood was consumed by public life. And she had her own ways of protecting the things that mattered to her. She wore a brooch. She told her brother to bow. Then the news came from Surrey. The household cavalry announced it on September 8, 2025. Captain Elizabeth Lizzie Godwin had been killed on the evening of September 5th, driving home from her base when her car was struck by another vehicle driven by a man later arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving while under the influence of alcohol. She was 28 years old. She had been training the next generation of Army recruits. She had been, in the specific and undramatic language of someone who loves their work, doing her job. The tributes were immediate and extensive. The military world, the equestrian world, the polo community, all of them posted and spoke and remembered. Her commanding officer's words were precise and honest in the way that the best eulogies are, the kind that do not reach for grandeur, but instead land on the particular truth of a person. That Lizzie would want to be remembered not as a pioneer or a symbol, but as a tough and talented young officer doing her utmost to serve and to lead. So that the trailblazing label, though accurate, was almost beside the point, because what she had cared about was not the milestone, but the work that came after it. The household cavalry described her as a truly kind, selfless, and committed friend to all, seeking opportunities even in the most difficult of circumstances. She had embodied servant leadership. She had left a huge void. The language of institutional tribute can sometimes sand the edges off a real person, but these words had been chosen carefully, and they landed. What happened next was not announced. It did not come through a press release or a formal statement from Kensington Palace. It emerged quietly in the accounts of people who were there and in the testimony of those who knew what it meant. A letter arrived, handwritten, from Princess Charlotte. She was 10 years old. She had been told, in whatever way parents tell a 10-year-old about death, that the woman on the horse, the one she had seen in the coronation procession, the one she had waved at, the one who had gotten goosebumps, was gone. And she had decided to do something about that. She had sat down and written a letter, a real letter, by hand, in the careful print or cursive of a child who takes the task seriously. She wrote about courage, about what it meant to break barriers, about dedication. She wrote about what it meant that Lizzie had been there, in that uniform, on that day. She wrote, "Although we never met, the story of Captain Elizabeth Godwin has touched me deeply." She sent the letter to the funeral. She sent a wreath with it. Captain Lizzie Godwin was given a full military funeral. Her coffin was followed by her partner and her mother, and the regiment she had loved. The letter from Princess Charlotte was read aloud during the service. She had never met her. That was the thing that ran through the room. They had never spoken. There had been a wave through a carriage window, a few seconds, a child's instinct, a smile. And from that single moment, a 10-year-old had understood enough to know that this woman's life and death meant something worth marking. Not because protocol required it, not because someone had arranged it, because Charlotte had decided it was right. The brooch in its horseshoe shape, the whisper to George to bow, the letter to a soldier she had never spoken to, written by hand, sent to a funeral. I read aloud. There is a thread running through all of it, if you look for it. Here is what the British monarchy is actually built on, underneath all the gold and protocol and ceremony that everyone can see from the outside. It is built on the idea that some people are asked to carry things the rest of us are not. Not power, necessarily. Not even tradition, in the shallow decorative sense. But memory. Continuity. The specific weight of standing in for something larger than any individual, who in front of millions of people, while also being a person who gets cold and tired and grief-stricken and 8 years old at their great-grandmother's funeral. The deal has always been strange. In exchange for the castles and the titles and the position, certain people in certain families agree to let their private selves become at least partly public property. They wave from balconies. They attend funerals in composed silence. They wear the inherited jewelry of people they loved and lost. And in public, where the significance cannot be a private thing, they make the abstract concrete. They turn institution into face. What was different about Charlotte, what the people who watched her most carefully, from royal commentators to the NFL players who met her backstage at a Taylor Swift concert and came away genuinely stunned, was that she seemed to understand the deal without having been broken by it. She carried the weight without being crushed into shapelessness by it. She remained, distinctly, herself. Jason Kelsey put it in the blunt way that athletes are sometimes allowed to put things that more diplomatic people soften into mush. He said, speaking on the New Heights podcast about meeting the Wales family before the Taylor Swift Eras tour concert in London in 2024, that Prince William had been fantastic and Prince George had been great, but that the highlight, the genuine standout, had been Charlotte. He said she was, and he was emphatic about this. Found so fucking adorable. He could not find the right words for it. He reached for the fact that he had 3 daughters now, that maybe that explained part of the reaction, but he kept coming back to the same thing. She had a fire to her. She was asking questions. She was asking questions. That was what got him, not the poise or the protocol or the careful performance of a child who had been coached in how to handle famous adults. The questions. The genuine, forward-leaning curiosity of a person who wanted to know things, who looked at the room she was in and decided it was interesting, who was not managing the encounter, but inhabiting it. This is the paradox at the center of Charlotte's public life. On the one hand, she is a child who has been prepared from birth for a life that is not normal, surrounded by security and protocol and the awareness that strangers are always watching. On the other hand, she is a child who refuses, apparently by temperament rather than strategy, to let that preparation hollow her out. The Diana comparison that people keep reaching for is not really about looks, though there are photographs where the resemblance is striking. It is about the quality of presence, the sense that the person inside the role is still fully present and not receding behind the role's requirements. At the 2024 Trooping the Color, Charlotte wore the horseshoe brooch again, saw she was in coordinating aquamarine with her mother, and she stood in the carriage looking out at the crowds and the soldiers and the enormous British machinery of military ceremony. And somewhere in that crowd, if you believed in the kind of thing that allows a pattern to be a pattern, was the knowledge of the woman on the black horse who had ridden in the same procession the year before. Lizzie Godwin had been very specific in her Tatler interview about what she believed a person's responsibility was when they were standing in front of something difficult. She said it in the context of riding with the sovereign's escort, in a uniform that was heavy and in weather that was hot and in a role that had never been held by a woman before. No matter what, you have to have a confident front, because if you don't believe in yourself, nobody else will. This is not advice about performance. This is advice about conviction. There is a difference between performing confidence and believing in the right of your own presence in a space. The first is a mask, and the second is armor, and only one of them holds up when it matters. Lizzie had lived by the second kind. Charlotte, in some version of it, appropriate to a 10-year-old who is also a princess and a person simultaneously, seemed to be learning the same thing. The death of Lizzie Godwin on September 5th, 2025, left a specific kind of grief in the institutions she had served. The household cavalry was a tight community, small enough that the loss of one person was genuinely felt throughout, not as an abstraction, but as an absence in the rooms and the stable yards and the polo fields and the hockey pitches where she had been present. Her commanding officer said the regiment was devastated. Her mother asked for privacy. The other driver had been arrested. Surrey police were appealing for witnesses. The mechanics of accident and investigation and mourning rolled forward in their blunt and impersonal way, because that is what happens after sudden death, regardless of how extraordinary the person was. Charlotte was 10 years old when she sat down to write the letter. She addressed it to the family and friends and colleagues of Captain Elizabeth Helen Godwin. She wrote with the particular precision of someone choosing their words carefully, in the way children sometimes write when they understand that this is a document that will be kept, that this is not a casual communication, but something that will last. She said she was there to remember an extraordinary woman, a shining example of courage and dedication. She said that, although they had never met, the story had touched her deeply. She called Lizzie's death a great loss, not just to the family and the regiment, but to the country. She said that what Lizzie had done in becoming the first woman in her regiment had required not just physical strength, but an unyielding will and an indomitable spirit. She said that Captain Godwin had dedicated her youth and her talent to serving the nation. A 10-year-old wrote that sentence. Dedicated her youth and talent to serving the nation. It is not the sentence of a child who is performing maturity. It is the sentence of someone who has grown up around service, who has watched it modeled by the adults around her, who understands at some cellular level what it means to give the best of yourself to something larger than yourself. Charlotte's whole life is, in one sense, a preparation for that kind of service. But the letter suggests that the preparation is not merely formal. It has gone somewhere real. The letter was read aloud at the military funeral, in the guards' chapel, or wherever the service was held, and in the specific silence of a military ceremony of mourning, a child's voice was read into the room. Charlotte was not there. Her presence was the letter and the wreath, the handwritten words and the flowers. But the household cavalry heard it. Lizzie's family heard it. Yet the people who had known her, who had ridden with her, and trained under her, and competed alongside her, and understood what she had built in a regiment that had not existed for her a decade before, heard a 10-year-old princess say that the story had touched her deeply, that the courage was real, that the loss was felt. Go back to the coronation one more time, to May 6th, 2023, to the gold coach and the roaring streets, and the 8-year-old in the carriage, and the 26-year-old on the black horse. In the moment that Lizzie described, the coach carrying the king had already gone past. Then came the carriage with Kate and Charlotte. The carriage moved through the archway into the palace forecourt. The noise was enormous. Charlotte looked over. She saw Lizzie. She was smiling. She waved as she went past. "What a magical moment that was," Lizzie said. "Why, I actually had goosebumps." Magical. The word is sometimes used lazily to describe things that are merely pleasant or mildly surprising. But Lizzie used it in the careful way, the way people use it when they mean something precise. The sense that something has happened, which is larger than its components, which cannot be entirely explained by its parts. An 8-year-old waved at a soldier. That is the fact of it, but the meaning of it. The woman who had broken through a door, shut for 3.5 centuries, being noticed and greeted in a single uncomplicated gesture by the daughter of the future king, carried something that went beyond the gesture itself. Something was being acknowledged. Something was being seen. Charlotte had been 7 at the funeral, and 8 at the coronation, and 9 at the next trooping, and 10 when she wrote the letter. She has been, across all of those ages, and someone who notices, who carries things forward, who reaches for the right gesture when the right gesture is called for, not because the handbook requires it, but because something in her understands what connection looks like and chooses it. The horseshoe brooch first appeared at a funeral and reappeared at parades. The instruction to bow was given at a state funeral by a 7-year-old who understood that the moment demanded it and that her brother needed the reminder. The wave at the coronation was given to the one woman in the escort, the one person doing something no one had done before. The letter was written to someone she had never met. None of these things required instruction. That is what makes them worth telling. The monarchy Charlotte is growing up into is a changed thing from the institution that shaped her great-grandmother. It is smaller in one sense, fewer working royals, more scrutiny, and less deference from a public that has watched enough and read enough to have its own complex feelings about what the crown costs and what it gives back. It is larger in another sense, more visible than ever, more scrutinized, more accountable to a kind of public attention that moves faster and cuts harder than anything Queen Elizabeth faced in the early decades of her reign. Charlotte will grow into it. She is growing into it already, and in the specific way that childhood experience becomes adult character, not through grand decisions, but through accumulation. Every public appearance, every moment of composure under pressure, every choice to wear the brooch or write the letter is building something. What it is building is not yet fully visible, because she is 10 years old, and the architecture of a person's life takes time to show its shape. But the shape is already suggesting itself. She is someone who notices. She is someone who carries things. She is someone who, at 7, looked at her great-grandmother's coffin and thought about what the moment required. Who at 8 looked out of a carriage window and saw the one woman in the escort and waved because it was right to wave. Who at 10 sat down and wrote a letter to a soldier she had never spoken to by hand and sent a wreath with it. Now and had the letter read aloud at the funeral of a woman who had given her whole short life to something worth giving a life to. Captain Lizzie Godwin was 28 years old. She won the Sword of Honor at Sandhurst. She was the first woman in the Lifeguards. She rode at a queen's funeral and a king's coronation. She got goosebumps from a wave. She died on a Surrey road on a September evening, driving home from work. Princess Charlotte is 10 years old. She wears a brooch shaped like a horseshoe. She tells her brother when to bow. She asks questions when she meets people. She wrote a letter. She sent flowers. The gold coach is back in storage, where it will stay until the next time Britain needs it. The black horses are in their stalls at Hyde Park Barracks. The household cavalry is, as it has been for 3.5 centuries, carrying on. And somewhere in a palace lies a 10-year-old girl who is growing towards something large and not yet fully known, is quietly, steadily doing the same.